At a crowded book signing, a trembling woman stepped forward and whispered, "He was my son." The room froze. Instead of stepping back, Keanu Reeves wrapped her in his arms and said words that silenced everyone around him. No one knew that moment would reopen the deepest wound of his own life. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The line stretched around the block, curling past the coffee shop and into the afternoon Sunday. Fans clutched books, posters, and phones, eager to meet the man whose humility had become legend. Inside the bookstore, the air buzzed with excitement. Cameras clicked, pens moved, and Keanu Reeves smiled gently at each person who stepped forward, signing their items with the same quiet gratitude he always carried. He thanked people for coming, made brief eye contact, and often asked, "How are you doing today?" A simple question, but one that made strangers feel seen. There was laughter at first. A young man handed Keanu a vintage Speed poster and nervously joked about seeing it with his dad in 1994. A group of college students held up a handmade sign that read, "We love you, Neo." The energy in the room was light and warm, filled with admiration and nostalgia. Keanu moved steadily down the table, his focus soft but present. He'd done hundreds of these events before, yet he still treated each encounter as personal. But then, in the middle of all that noise, the rhythm broke. A hush began at the edge of the line, spreading forward like a ripple. Keanu noticed a woman stepping closer, her movements uncertain, her hands clutching something small and framed. She looked out of place among the eager fans. Her eyes were red, her lips pressed tightly together, and she seemed to be fighting to stay upright. The store lights reflected faintly off the glass of the frame she carried, revealing a smiling boy, maybe 8 years old, with curly hair and bright eyes. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the table but didn't set anything down to sign. Her fingers trembled as she held the photo to her chest. Keanu looked up, expecting perhaps a shy greeting. Instead, she whispered, barely audible, "He was my son." The words cut through the air like a secret only meant for him. For a moment, time slowed. The chatter faded behind her, and all Keanu could hear was the quiet thud of his own heartbeat. He saw her shoulders shaking, her knuckles white from holding onto that picture so tightly it seemed she might break it. Keanu rose from his chair without a word. He reached out slowly, not as a celebrity greeting a fan, but as a man recognizing another soul's pain. When she looked into his eyes, something passed between them, a shared understanding that didn't need words. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder, and she began to cry. The crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, fell completely silent. He didn't speak right away. He just stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her. It was not rehearsed, not staged. It was human. And in that embrace, every camera lowered. The energy of the room shifted from excitement to reverence, as if everyone had suddenly remembered that behind fame and faces, we are all fragile, grieving beings searching for connection. When Keanu finally whispered, his voice was calm but heavy with truth. "The pain doesn't go away," he said softly, "but we can learn to walk with it." The woman wept quietly against his shoulder, and the crowd remained frozen. No one dared to interrupt. The woman's sobs echoed faintly through the still bookstore. Even those at the far end of the line felt the shift. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing everyone into silence. Keanu didn't pull away quickly. He stayed there, holding her as she tried to breathe through the storm that had suddenly risen from deep inside her. He could feel her shaking, her heartbreak raw and unfiltered. He said nothing more he didn't need to. When she finally stepped back, her cheeks were streaked with tears, and her mascara had smudged beneath her eyes. Yet there was something different about her face, now a faint softness, a release. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Thank you." Keanu nodded gently, his expression both solemn and compassionate. He placed his hand over his heart and replied quietly, "You're not alone." The woman hesitated before leaving. She turned once more, almost as if wanting to explain her presence, but words failed her. She clutched the frame tighter and walked toward the exit. People moved aside for her. giving space, their eyes following her until she disappeared into the bright California afternoon. When Keanu sat back down, the table before him seemed smaller. The laughter and chatter didn't return right away. Even the sound of the pens and the clicking cameras felt different, softer, uncertain. The next fan in line, a man in his 20s, approached slowly, unsure whether to speak. Keanu managed a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Go ahead." The signing continued, but the energy had changed. Fans no longer rushed their moments. Each person lingered just a little longer, sharing kind words, personal stories, or quiet gratitude. It was as if that single encounter had reminded everyone of something sacred, the humanity that often hides beneath daily noise. Across the room, the event coordinator wiped her eyes discreetly. She had worked dozens of celebrity signings before, but never one like this. Later, she would tell her staff, it wasn't just a signing anymore. It felt like church. Keanu's thoughts, however, were far from the crowd. The woman's trembling voice still echoed inside him. The look in her eyes, broken, searching, familiar, had unlocked something buried deep within his own heart. He tried to shake it off and focus on the smiling faces before him, but flashes of memory intruded. The hospital hallway, the flowers, the empty room where once there had been laughter. He signed another book, then another, yet his hand moved automatically. Inside, his mind drifted back to a different day, years ago, when he had also stood holding a picture of someone he loved, unable to speak through the weight of grief. A young girl in line offered him a small gift, a folded paper crane. "For good luck," she said shyly. Keanu thanked her softly, taking it with both hands. He looked at the tiny crane, fragile but carefully made, and felt something stir. Maybe, he thought, the universe sends reminders at the moments we least expect them. By the time the signing ended, the sun had dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows through the store's front windows. Most fans had left, but the energy of that moment lingered like an invisible echo. Staff members quietly began packing boxes, yet no one spoke about what had happened. They didn't need to. The silence itself carried meaning. Keanu stood near the table, hands in his pockets, eyes drifting toward the door where the woman had walked out hours earlier. He could still picture her trembling hands, the photo pressed against her chest, and the pain that seemed to spill from her without permission. For a long moment, he stayed still, almost afraid that moving would break something fragile that had formed in the air. His assistant approached, speaking softly. "That was something else, wasn't it?" Keanu gave a small nod, his expression thoughtful. "She's carrying a lot." You could feel it. There was no trace of ego in his voice, no sense of performance. He wasn't thinking about how the story might trend online, or how the moment might appear in headlines. He was thinking about the woman herself, how much courage it took for her to walk up to him, surrounded by hundreds of strangers, and speak her truth aloud. He wondered how long she had been holding that grief inside before finally letting it out. As the bookstore lights dimmed, Keanu reached for his jacket. The event coordinator stopped him at the door. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, "I've been doing this a long time. I've seen people cry, scream, even faint around celebrities. But what you did today, that was real. Thank you for letting it happen." He smiled faintly, his eyes tired but kind. She needed someone to listen. Sometimes, that's all it takes. When he stepped outside, the city's night air felt cool against his skin. Neon lights flickered along the street, and distant traffic hummed in the background. He walked alone toward the parking lot, the paper crane still in his pocket. He turned it over in his fingers before setting it on the dashboard once inside his car. As he started the engine, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, he saw something unexpected, his younger self. The one who had stood by a hospital bed years ago, wishing for just one more heartbeat that never came. The same ache flickered in his chest. Familiar, but not as sharp as before. He whispered to the empty car, almost as if speaking to that woman again. "The pain doesn't go away, but maybe we can carry it differently." Outside, Los Angeles glittered like 1,000 untold stories. Somewhere in that vast city, a grieving mother was driving home with a lighter heart because a stranger had seen her pain and embraced it instead of turning away. Keanu knew he wouldn't forget her face. And deep down, he sensed this encounter wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a journey he didn't yet understand. The night was quiet when Keanu returned home. The hum of the city faded behind him as he closed the door to his apartment and set his keys on the counter. The world outside was still full of lights and noise, but inside, only silence remained. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that reminded him of what used to be. He walked through the dim room, passing by books, photographs, and a few framed movie posters that no longer held the same meaning they once did. On the corner of his desk sat a small framed picture. The photo had been there for years, untouched, yet never forgotten. It showed him and Jennifer standing together, smiling under a Los Angeles sky that now felt like another lifetime. Next to it was a candle that he often lit when he needed to think or when the past felt closer than usual. Tonight, he struck a match and watched the small flame rise. Its reflection flickered against the glass, illuminating the picture like a quiet ghost. He leaned back against the desk and stared at the flame, feeling the same ache that never quite left him. That woman's trembling hands at the bookstore had stirred something he'd tried to bury. The way she clutched her child's photo mirrored how he had once held onto every memory of the daughter he never met. It wasn't just empathy he had felt, it was recognition. He walked to the window and looked out over the city. From this height, the streets looked peaceful, but he knew better. Somewhere out there, countless others were grieving too, pretending to function while their hearts were shattered. He thought of Jennifer, her laughter, her warmth, and the moment everything changed. A faint sound echoed in his mind. Hospital machines, soft voices, the rush of footsteps. He could almost smell the antiseptic air again, see the pale walls and the sterile light. He remembered standing alone in that hallway, unable to comprehend how a single sentence could erase an entire future. That day, the world had become quieter, heavier, and though time had dulled the sharpness of the pain, it had never truly disappeared. He whispered softly to the empty room, "It never really goes away." The candle flame wavered as if it understood. He thought again of the woman at the signing, how her grief had poured out in public, something he himself had never done. He had hidden his pain behind calm smiles and long silences, thinking it was strength. But now, after seeing her courage, he wasn't so sure. Maybe silence wasn't healing. Maybe it was just another way of carrying the weight alone. The candlelight flickered across Keanu's face as he sank into the old leather chair by the window. The city below glowed faintly through the glass, a blur of headlights and neon, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He could still remember the last night he and Jennifer talked about their baby. They had chosen names, laughed nervously about diapers and paint colors for the nursery. They were scared but happy, believing in tomorrow. Then came the call. The sudden stillness, the unbearable truth that no one should ever have to hear. Their little girl had been born, sleeping. In the following days, he moved like a shadow. People spoke to him, but their words felt far away, muffled by the thick fog of grief. He went through the motions, the arrangements, the condolences, but everything felt unreal, like a dream he couldn't wake from. He remembered standing in the cemetery, a gray sky above, rain falling softly as he held an umbrella over Jennifer. That numbness lasted for months. He threw himself into work, into roles that demanded everything from him, because silence was easier than memory. But grief has a way of following, no matter how far one runs. There were nights he would wake suddenly, heart pounding, thinking he had heard a baby crying. Only the empty apartment answered back. Years later, when Jennifer died in that car accident, it was as if the same wound had been ripped open again. The world had already taken one part of his heart. Now, it took the rest. He stopped talking about it entirely. People around him meant well, they said. Time heals, but time doesn't heal. It only teaches us how to hide the scars. He looked around the room now, years removed but not truly distant. The candle flame danced in the still air, its faint smoke curling toward the ceiling. In its light, he saw both loss and life, an echo of what he'd loved and what he'd lost. That woman at the signing had stirred all of this back to the surface. Her trembling voice had mirrored his own silent prayers. He leaned forward and whispered to himself, "We walk with it." That's what I told her. The phrase replayed in his mind, circling like a haunting truth. Maybe that was what he had been doing all along, walking with pain, not escaping it. But as he sat there, surrounded by reminders of the past, he felt something else rise within him. A quiet realization that perhaps he could do more than walk with it. Perhaps he could help others do the same. The thought lingered, like the faint scent of wax in the air, fragile but growing stronger with each heartbeat. Keanu rose from the chair and walked slowly toward the window. Below, the city pulsed with life cars rushing by, strangers laughing, lights blinking in patterns that didn't seem to notice the pain of those who watched from behind glass. He pressed a hand against the cold surface and watched his reflection blur with the city's glow. For a moment, his face seemed to merge with every grieving soul in the world, each of them silently holding their own candle in the dark. He could still hear Jennifer's voice, faint but clear in memory. She used to say, "We're all just trying to love as much as we can before the world takes it back." Those words had once sounded poetic. Now they felt like prophecy. He realized how much he had buried since losing her, how many times he'd chosen silence instead of sharing the truth, that pain, when hidden, only multiplies. He turned away from the glass and sat down again, picking up the small picture frame from the desk. He studied Jennifer's eyes, the same warmth that used to calm him when everything else felt uncertain. Beneath the photo was another smaller one, a sonogram, faded at the edges. He hadn't looked at it in years. Now, holding it in his hand, he felt both the ache and the peace that came from remembering instead of running. For a long while, he said nothing. The only sound was the candle crackling softly, as if whispering reminders from another time. Then he began to think of the people he'd met over the years, the grieving fans who had quietly slipped letters into his hand at events, the widowers who spoke to him about courage, the mothers who said his movies had given them moments of escape when they needed it most. He'd always thanked them politely, but never truly engaged beyond a smile. He'd thought that keeping distance was kindness. Now he wasn't so sure. The woman at the signing had changed something in him. She had forced him to look inward, to face what he'd locked away. He realized that grief didn't isolate him. It connected him to millions who had felt the same unbearable absence. Every person who had lost someone they loved carried that invisible scar. And maybe, by acknowledging it openly, they could help one another walk forward again. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Silence feels safe," he murmured. "But it's also lonely." The candle had burned low, its pool of wax shimmering. He watched the flame flicker and then steady itself again, as if refusing to die. It felt symbolic, a reminder that light could live even inside brokenness. When he finally rose to blow out the flame, he didn't make a wish or a prayer. He simply paused, letting the glow fade gently. The darkness that followed didn't feel empty, it felt honest. He understood now that the silence he'd chosen for years wasn't peace. It was hiding, and he was done hiding. 2 days passed before life began to feel normal again. Keanu went through the motions, meetings, interviews, script readings, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that woman in the bookstore. Her tears, her trembling voice, the way she had clutched the photograph as if letting go would mean losing her son all over again. He couldn't shake it. Every time he tried, the image returned, vivid and uninvited. That afternoon, while sorting through mail in his office, his assistant entered, carrying a small white envelope. "This came for you," she said, placing it gently on the desk. There was no return address, only his name written in neat, careful handwriting. Something about the way the letters curved made him pause. He slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a folded piece of stationery. The moment he unfolded it, his chest tightened. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places, as if tears had touched the paper. "Mr. Reeves, you don't know me beyond that moment in the bookstore, but I needed to thank you." He stopped reading for a second, the sound of her voice echoing in his mind. He remembered the faint scent of rain in her hair, the way her shoulders collapsed when he hugged her. He took a deep breath and continued reading. "That hug was the first time I felt human again since the accident. For months, people have looked at me with pity or avoided me altogether. But when you held me, I didn't feel like a broken mother anymore. I just felt seen. My name is Claire Morgan. My son's name was Daniel. He was 8. He loved comic books and peanut butter sandwiches and telling stories about superheroes. The day we lost him, the world stopped moving. Until that moment with you, I thought I would never move again." Keanu set the letter down for a moment, pressing a hand to his mouth. His throat ached, the way it always did when emotion crept too close. He turned the letter over, reading the last lines written in a trembling script. "You told me the pain doesn't go away, but that we can learn to walk with it. How do I learn that? How did you learn it?" The words seemed to reach inside him, stirring the ache that still lived beneath the surface. He had said that line without thinking, a truth that had come from somewhere deep and wordless. Now, for the first time, someone was asking him to explain it. He folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and stared at the candle still sitting on his desk. The wax had hardened from the night before. He struck a match and relit it, watching the flame rise and sway. "How do we learn?" he whispered to himself. The question lingered like smoke in the air. Keanu sat motionless for a long time, the letter resting open beside the candle. Outside, sunlight filtered through the blinds, drawing thin golden lines across the desk. He traced them absent-mindedly, still hearing Claire's question in his head. How do I learn to walk with it? The simplicity of it made it harder to answer. It wasn't the kind of question one could fix with platitudes or philosophy. It was raw and real, the kind of question that demanded honesty, born of experience. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The memories from the past few nights returned the flicker of candlelight, the reflection of Jennifer's smile in the frame, the emptiness that used to consume him. He thought about the years it had taken to stop asking why and start asking how. How to keep living, how to keep loving, how to face mornings when the ache felt unbearable. He picked up the letter again, reading it once more, slower this time. The part about her son struck him deeply. 8 years old, full of life and imagination, just like the children he often met on film sets who would excitedly tell him about their dreams. The thought that Daniel's laughter had been silenced too soon made his heart twist. Keanu reached for his phone and opened a note file, typing a few words. Grief is a language only the broken understand. Then he stopped, deleting it. Words alone felt empty tonight. He needed to feel something real, something that would connect the invisible line between him and Claire, between every parent, sibling, and friend who had ever faced the unthinkable. He walked to the bookshelf and pulled down a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were old letters, mementos, and a folded piece of paper Jennifer had written not long before the accident. He unfolded it slowly. The ink was faded, but her handwriting was unmistakable. If one day we can't walk together, I hope you'll keep walking for both of us. He stared at the words until they blurred. The timing felt impossible, almost divine. He looked back at Claire's letter, feeling an unexpected sense of connection across time, as if Jennifer's message was answering Claire's question through him. He sat down again, the weight of both letters before him, one from the past, one from the present, 2 voices speaking the same truth. He knew then that this wasn't a coincidence. The woman in the bookstore hadn't just crossed his path by chance. Her pain had come to remind him of something he'd forgotten, that healing wasn't something you finish, it's something you share. He folded both letters together and placed them beside the candle. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of purpose begin to form. Something told him this was only the beginning. That night, Keanu couldn't sleep. He sat by the window again, the same place where memory and quiet often met. The city lights glimmered below, but his eyes stayed fixed on the candle's reflection in the glass. On the table behind him lay the two letters, Jennifer's and Claire's, resting together like a bridge between two worlds of grief. He replayed that afternoon in his mind. The bookstore, the trembling photo, the silent hug. He had spoken words that day without realizing how deeply they would echo. We can learn to walk with it. At the time, he had said it to comfort someone else. Now, he realized he had also been speaking to himself. He picked up a pen and a sheet of paper, intending only to write down a few thoughts. But the moment the ink touched the page, the words began to pour out. Dear Claire, you asked me how to walk with the pain. I wish there were an easy answer. There isn't. For years, I tried to pretend mine was gone. I buried it under work, under silence. But grief has a way of waiting. It never leaves. It only changes shape. Some days it whispers, other days it roars. But if you keep moving, even slowly, it begins to walk beside you, instead of inside you. He paused, breathing deeply before continuing. The love you had for Daniel that doesn't end, it never will. Love and pain are two sides of the same coin, and to lose one would be to lose the other. Don't try to silence your grief. Listen to it. Let it teach you what love really means when there's nothing left but memory. The words flowed naturally, not polished or rehearsed, but genuine. He didn't think about fame or image. He thought about two people, himself and Claire, trying to find footing on the same uneven ground. When he finished, he folded the note and set it beside her letter. He didn't plan to send it. Not yet. Something told him the right moment would come. For now, it was enough to have written it, to have turned pain into something with purpose. He leaned back, letting the quiet fill the room again. The candle's flame danced gently, its light reflecting in his eyes. He felt Jennifer's presence there, faint but warm, as though she was proud of what he had just done. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone in his grief. He whispered into the silence, maybe this is how it starts. As he watched the flame steady, he realized that Claire's letter had done something no one else could. It had reopened his heart, not to pain, but to connection. Something inside him whispered that this encounter wasn't just fate, it was a calling. The next morning, sunlight crept across Keanu's desk, brushing over the letters that still lay beside the candle. He sat with a cup of black coffee, reading Claire's note one more time. The words carried a quiet strength, a trembling honesty that stayed with him. For the first time in years, he felt a pull to reach out, not as an actor, not as a public figure, but as someone who understood. He picked up his phone and called his foundation's office. There's a letter I received from a woman named Claire Morgan, he said to his assistant, his tone calm but deliberate. Could you find a way to contact her? I'd like to speak with her if she's comfortable. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a soft, of course, Keanu. Hours later, his assistant forwarded Claire's number. Keanu hesitated before dialing, his thumb hovering over the call button. He wasn't sure what he would say. There was no script for this kind of conversation. When he finally pressed it, his heart beat faster than he expected. Hello? A gentle voice answered. Hi, this is Keanu Reeves. There was silence on the line, followed by a soft intake of breath. Oh my God, I didn't expect you to call. I got your letter, he said quietly. I wanted to thank you for writing it. Your words, they meant something to me. Claire didn't respond at first. Then her voice came through, trembling but sincere. That hug changed something in me. She stopped to steady herself. I didn't think anyone would understand. I've been trying to keep going, but it's hard when the world moves on and you're still stuck in that one day. Keanu listened, his silence warm and patient. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to offer solutions. He simply let her speak. She told him about her son, Daniel, how he loved to draw superheroes, how his laughter filled their house, how he always insisted on sleeping with the light on because he believed it helped the stars find him. Then she described the day of the accident, the flash of headlights, the silence afterward, and the unbearable emptiness that followed. "I stopped leaving the house for months," she admitted. "The walls became my comfort. People told me to be strong, but I didn't want to be. I just wanted my little boy back." Keanu's throat tightened, but he stayed composed. "I understand," he said softly. "You don't have to be strong all the time." The line went quiet again, filled only by the faint sound of her breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but tired. "How did you do it?" she asked. "How did you learn to walk with it?" He thought for a long moment before answering, "By realizing I couldn't do it alone." The conversation lingered longer than either of them had expected. Once the initial awkwardness faded, the words began to flow more naturally. Claire's voice softened as she talked, and Keanu found himself leaning back in his chair, eyes closed, listening as if he were hearing a story he already knew by heart. She told him how she used to take Daniel to the park every Sunday, rain or shine. They would feed ducks by the pond, race each other to the swings, and end the day with ice cream from a cart near the gate. "He always chose vanilla," she said with a faint laugh, "because he said it looked like clouds." Her laugh cracked halfway through the sentence, but she didn't stop. "After he died, I couldn't even drive by that park. I'd take the long way home just to avoid it." Keanu didn't say anything for a moment. Then he replied, "I used to do the same. I'd avoid places that reminded me of the people I'd lost. But I realized those places didn't hurt me. They held the parts of them I loved most. Going back was how I learned to remember them without falling apart." There was a pause on the line, and then a soft exhale from Claire. "That makes sense," she whispered. "But it's so hard to go back." "It always will be," Keanu said. "But it gets a little easier when you know someone else understands." Something in his tone made her quiet again, as though she could hear the years of pain behind his calm voice. She didn't know the full story of what he had lost, but she could sense it, an invisible thread of shared sorrow connecting them. Before hanging up, Keanu asked gently, "Do you have anyone to talk to about all this?" "Not really," she admitted. "Friends try to help, but they don't know what to say. Sometimes they just stop calling. I think they're afraid of saying the wrong thing." "I understand that too," he said softly. "When I went through it, I went to a small grief group for a while. Nobody there tried to fix anything. We just sat and shared. It wasn't about moving on, it was about not being alone in it." Claire hesitated, her voice trembling again. "Did that help you?" He nodded instinctively before remembering she couldn't see him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It didn't take the pain away, but it made it less lonely." There was a faint sound on the line, like she was wiping away tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for calling me. You didn't have to." "I did," Keanu replied. "You reminded me why it matters." After they said goodbye, he sat in silence, holding the phone loosely in his hand. The call had lasted only 20 minutes, but it left him feeling changed, humbled, grounded, and deeply aware of how many people were silently carrying the same kind of ache. That night, the city felt unusually quiet. Keanu sat at his desk once more, the candle burning low, its soft light flickering against the pages of his open journal. The conversation with Claire kept replaying in his mind, not her pain, but her courage. She had dared to speak, dared to reach out, instead of retreat further into silence. That simple act felt monumental. He thought about how many others never made that call. How many people were sitting in dark rooms right now, clutching photographs, wishing someone would just listen. The realization pressed heavily on him. For years, he had carried his grief privately, believing it was something to be endured in solitude. But maybe that belief had been wrong. Maybe healing required company. He took a pen and began to write in his journal, letting the thoughts pour out in uneven lines. We talk about love, but rarely about what happens after love is taken from us. We talk about success, but not about survival. There are millions of people walking through this invisible storm, and all they need is a hand to hold. He paused, tapping the pen against the page. Then he added another line, one that felt like a whisper from his own heart. Create a space for shared healing, no spotlight, no cameras. He underlined it once, then again. The idea took root as soon as he wrote it. What if there was a place where people could simply talk and listen? A place without judgment, without fame, where grief could breathe without being rushed. He thought back to those grief support meetings he'd attended years ago, sitting quietly in the back under a different name. No one had known who he was, and that anonymity had been freeing. He had listened to people tell their stories, their heartbreaks, their regrets, and each story had reminded him that pain wasn't unique. Everyone carried it differently, but the ache was universal. The memory of those meetings came flooding back, the warm coffee and paper cups, the dim lighting, the soft hum of voices breaking the silence together. He remembered one man saying, "I just need someone to remember her with me." That sentence had stayed with him for years. Maybe that was what grief truly was. The need for remembrance shared. Keanu closed his journal slowly. Outside, the night breeze carried faint city sounds through the window. He looked toward the horizon, where the faintest trace of dawn was beginning to show. He whispered softly to himself, "If even one person finds light through this, it'll be worth it." The candle's flame flickered, steady and calm. In that moment, Keanu felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not peace exactly, but purpose. A quiet conviction began to form, fragile yet unwavering. He didn't know how it would take shape or what it would become, but one thing was certain: the seed had been planted. 3 weeks later, Keanu sat in his car outside a small community center in East Los Angeles. The building wasn't much faded brick, a flickering street lamp, a sign that read Haven Hall. It was the kind of place that most people passed without noticing. But to him, it felt right. Modest, quiet, human. He had rented the space under the name Project Lantern. The name had come to him one night as he watched the candle on his desk burn low. He thought about how a single flame could push back so much darkness, even for just a moment. That was what he wanted this project to be, a small light for people who had forgotten what light looked like. The flyers he printed were simple, almost plain. No mention of his name, no photos, no logos. Just a single message in black letters. For anyone who has loved and lost, come talk, come listen. He had posted them in libraries, coffee shops, churches, and hospital bulletin boards. He didn't know if anyone would come, but he knew he had to try. As he sat there now, watching the rain begin to fall in soft streaks across his windshield, he felt a familiar nervousness rise inside him. He wasn't sure what he would say, or if he even should lead. This wasn't about him, it was about the people who showed up. He looked at the time, 6:55 p.m. The meeting was set for 7. He grabbed a thermos of coffee from the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. Inside, the community room was dimly lit. Folding chairs were arranged in a loose circle. A metal coffee pot sat on a small table beside a box of tissues. It smelled faintly of old wood and rain. He was still setting out extra chairs when the door opened. A middle-aged woman peeked in, holding a soaked umbrella. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "Is this Project Lantern?" she asked quietly. Keanu nodded. "Yes, you're in the right place." She smiled nervously and stepped inside. Soon, another person arrived, a young man in a worn army jacket. Then an older gentleman with a limp. A few minutes later, 3 more came, 2 women and 1 man. 6 in total, not counting Keanu. When they had all taken seats, the room fell into an awkward silence. No one quite knew how to start. The sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the gap. Keanu looked around the circle. The faces before him were tired, fragile, hopeful. He cleared his throat and spoke softly. "You don't have to be okay to be here." The tension in the room eased slightly. A few people nodded. One woman exhaled as if she had been holding her breath all week. For a long moment, no one spoke. The rain outside created a steady rhythm, a gentle backdrop to their silence. Then, as if the quiet itself had given permission, the first story began. It came from the woman with the umbrella. Her name was Ruth. She spoke softly, almost apologetically. as if afraid her grief might burden the room. She said her husband had died 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack. One morning he was drinking coffee beside her, and by that afternoon, he was gone. She said she still set 2 cups out every morning, one for him, one for her. As she spoke, her voice wavered. She wiped her eyes with the tissue Keanu slid toward her, whispering, "Sorry, I didn't mean to cry." Keanu shook his head gently. "You don't have to apologize for love," he said. She smiled faintly, then nodded. The next voice came from the young man in the army jacket. He introduced himself as Leo. His best friend from his unit had taken his own life 6 months earlier. Leo said he hadn't slept properly since. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his friend's face. "We survived the same battles," he said quietly. "I just don't understand why I'm still here, and he's not." The group listened intently. No one tried to fix his pain. No one told him to move on. They simply let his words fill the space until he had said everything he needed to. Keanu recognized that. Sound the release of truth after too long a silence. He had felt it himself once, years ago, in a grief group that had saved him more than he cared to admit. Then came Maria, a woman in her 30s. She spoke through trembling lips about losing her baby halfway through pregnancy. "Everyone told me to look forward, to try again," she said, her voice breaking. "But I don't want another baby. I just want her." She pressed her hand to her chest, as if holding something invisible there. No one looked away. Not even the older man who had been staring at the floor since the meeting began. When Maria finished, he finally lifted his head. His name was Howard. He was in his 70s, his hands rough and calloused. "My son was a firefighter," he said simply. "He never made it out of the building." His eyes glistened but never overflowed. "It's been 10 years, feels like yesterday." The circle grew still again. Each story deepened the air, not with heaviness, but with honesty. The pain in the room didn't divide them, it connected them. Keanu looked around at each face, feeling the quiet courage in their eyes. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "I lost someone too. 2 someones, actually." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The group understood. The room stayed silent after Keanu spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded answers. It was the kind that allowed hearts to breathe. He could see it in their eyes. Relief. The moment he admitted his own loss, something invisible shifted. The distance between them vanished. They were no longer strangers sharing stories. They were fellow travelers, walking the same uncertain road. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, speaking quietly. "I used to think grief was something to conquer," he said. "Something you could fix if you tried hard enough. But I learned it's not an enemy. It's love, with nowhere to go." Ruth nodded slowly, tears spilling again. "That's exactly what it feels like," she whispered. "I still love him, but there's nowhere to put it." Keanu offered a small smile. "Then maybe this is where we can put it. Here, together." The group sat in a fragile but warm silence. One by one, they began to speak again, short sentences, confessions that had waited years to be spoken. Leo admitted that he kept his friend's dog tags under his pillow. Maria said she still talked to her daughter every night before bed. Howard said he carried a photo of his son in his wallet, worn so thin he could barely see the face anymore. Keanu listened to every word, nodding, never interrupting. His role wasn't to lead, but to hold space to remind them through his quiet presence that they weren't alone. He felt his own pain softening with theirs, melting into something that didn't hurt quite as sharply. The rain had stopped outside, replaced by the soft hum of passing cars. Someone poured coffee from the pot into small paper cups. Ruth handed one to Leo, who smiled for the first time that evening. It wasn't much a flicker of comfort, but it was real. As the meeting drew to a close, Keanu looked around the room and saw something remarkable. The faces that had entered filled with uncertainty now held traces of connection. Not joy exactly, but recognition. He could feel it, an unspoken understanding that no one had to face their loss in silence anymore. Before leaving, Maria placed her hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Thank you for this." He shook his head gently. "No," he said. "Thank you for coming." When the last person left, Keanu stayed behind, stacking the chairs one by one. The floor was still damp where tears had fallen. He looked around the empty room, hearing faint echoes of laughter and pain mingling in the air. For the first time in years, he didn't feel haunted by grief. He felt guided by it. He switched off the lights, leaving only the small lamp glowing in the corner. As he stepped outside into the cool night, a quiet sense of purpose followed him. He knew he would come back next week, and so would they. The following week, the folding chairs were arranged again in a circle, this time with a quiet expectancy in the air. Word had spread gently, no flyers, no announcements, just whispers among those who had attended the first meeting. By 7 o'clock, the room was half full. Keanu arrived early, as he always did, setting out cups and tissues, the small rituals that made the space feel safe. As the door opened, he looked up and saw a familiar face. Claire stepped in, clutching a small cardboard box to her chest. Her expression was softer than before, though her eyes still carried traces of sleepless nights. When she saw him, she smiled, faintly. "I hope it's okay that I came," she said quietly. He returned the smile. "I'm glad you did." She took a seat beside Ruth, setting the box gently on the floor. The others greeted her with nods of quiet recognition. They had heard about her from Keanu, though never in detail. Tonight, they would meet her story in her own words. When the group settled, Keanu spoke briefly, his tone calm and steady. "This is a space for honesty," he said. "No one here has to hide their story. We just listen." Claire looked down at the box between her feet. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside were sheets of paper, each one covered in crayon drawings, bright colors, stick figures, smiling suns, and crooked hearts. She took one out and held it up. "These were my sons," she said. "Daniel loved to draw. He said he wanted to be an artist, or maybe a superhero who paints the sky." Her voice broke on the last word, and she laughed softly through the tears. "I told him he already did." She passed a few drawings around the circle. The others handled them carefully, as though they were sacred. One showed a little boy and his mother holding hands beneath a rainbow. Another showed a figure in a cape standing in front of a burning building. Leo smiled gently. "He had imagination," he said. Claire nodded, her eyes glistening. "He used to make up stories before bed. Every night, I'd read to him, and then he'd tell me how he'd change the ending. He said stories were better when someone you love survives." Her lip trembled, and she wiped her eyes. "After he died, I kept reading to him anyway. I'd sit on his bed and read out loud, hoping he could still hear me." No one moved or spoke. Even the hum of the lights above seemed distant. The grief in her voice wasn't heavy, it was tender, like the echo of love refusing to fade. Keanu watched her closely, his chest tightening with the same ache he'd once carried alone. She looked up at him, searching for words. "I still set a plate for him at dinner," she said softly. "People tell me to stop, but I can't. It feels wrong not to." He nodded slowly. "It's okay to keep loving him," he said. "That's what keeps him close." Claire took a shaky breath and smiled through the tears. "Some nights," she said, "I sit at the table and imagine him sitting across from me, swinging his legs, telling me about school. I even ask him what he learned that day." She gave a small laugh that faded almost instantly. "I know he's not there, but somehow it helps me breathe." Ruth reached over and touched her arm gently. "That's not crazy," she whispered. "That's love still doing its job." Claire looked around the circle, realizing she wasn't being judged. For the first time in years, she didn't have to apologize for the way she grieved. Her shoulders eased, her voice steadied. "People stopped calling after a few months," she continued. "They didn't know what to say, and I didn't know what to tell them. So, I just stayed home. I stopped going out, stopped answering the door. I thought, if I heard, disappeared. Maybe the pain would too, but it never did. It just sat with me, quietly, every single day. Keanu listened intently, his eyes soft but focused. He knew that silence intimately, the kind that follows loss and stays even when the world moves on. He leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes, silence feels safe," he said gently, "but it can turn into a prison." Claire nodded, her gaze lowering to the floor. That's exactly what it became. The room was still, except for the sound of her opening the box again. She pulled out a smaller drawing, this one of a candle. "He drew this one a week before the accident," she said. "He told me it was a magic light that could keep people from getting lost." Her fingers trembled as she held it up. "I think that's what he's still doing for me." Leo wiped his eyes discreetly. Ruth pressed a tissue to her mouth to stop a sob. The power of that small drawing filled the room with warmth. Claire looked at Keanu then. "You told me something that day," she said softly. "You said the pain doesn't go away, but we can learn to walk with it. I didn't understand it until now. Maybe this," she gestured around the circle, "is what walking with it looks like." He gave a faint smile. "I think so." Her lip quivered again. "Do you ever stop missing them?" Keanu paused for a long time, eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but unwavering. "No," he said, "you don't stop missing them. You just learn to carry the missing differently." The group sat in silence again, the truth settling like soft rain. Claire's hands trembled as she placed the drawings back into the box. She whispered, almost to herself, "I think Daniel would have liked it here." Keanu met her eyes and said softly, "I think he's already here." The air in the room felt changed, gentler, deeper. No one moved for a long while after Keanu spoke. The candle drawing still sat on the table between them, its bright colors glowing under the soft light. It felt symbolic, as if Daniel's little artwork had become the room's heart. Claire pressed her palms together in her lap, her breathing uneven but calmer than when she'd first arrived. Keanu reached forward slowly and knelt beside her chair. The gesture startled her at first. She tried to speak, but the emotion in her throat silenced her. He placed one hand lightly over hers, grounding her in the present. "You don't have to hold it all alone anymore," he said quietly. "We can carry some of it with you." Her tears came again, but this time they weren't from despair. They felt like release. She nodded, unable to find words. The others watched silently, moved not just by her pain, but by the tenderness in the moment, how something as simple as a touch could hold more meaning than any speech. When she finally steadied, Keanu stood again and took his seat. The group remained still, the circle of connection unbroken. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had paused to listen. Then, in the same quiet tone he always used, he said, "There's something I want to share too." They turned toward him, surprised. He rarely spoke about himself. He looked down at his hands before continuing. "I had a daughter once," he said softly. "She was never born alive." The words hung in the air, heavy and tender. Claire's eyes widened, her breath catching in her chest. Even Ruth's hands froze mid-motion. No one had ever heard him speak of this, not the press, not the fans, not even the people who worked closest to him. His voice wavered only slightly as he went on. "She would have been around Daniel's age now," he said. "Her mother, Jennifer, she passed not long after. For a long time, I thought silence was the only way to survive it. But hearing all of you, seeing what you've shared, it reminds me that speaking it doesn't make it hurt more. It makes it real." The group sat stunned, their hearts heavy with empathy. Claire's trembling hand reached across the circle, resting lightly on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting us with that." Keanu smiled faintly, eyes glistening in the low light. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me what it means to remember with love." The circle closed again in silence. No applause, no consoling cliches, just a sacred quiet filled with understanding. The flicker of the candle drawing seemed to glow brighter in the stillness. Cameras would never see this moment, nor should they. It wasn't for the world. It was for them, for the broken who had found, even briefly, a way to hold light together. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady, washing the night clean. By the time the fourth week arrived, the small community center had begun to feel like a second home. The coffee always brewed before the first person walked through the door. Folding chairs formed their familiar circle. The scent of rain and old wood had become strangely comforting. Each week brought new faces, and with them, new stories. But there was one man who hadn't said a single word. His name was Ray Douglas. He sat in the same chair every session, third from the left, near the window. His posture was stiff, his gaze distant. The lines on his face were deep, carved from years of both laughter and loss. He wore a gray flannel jacket and always arrived a few minutes early, yet he never spoke. When it was his turn to share, he simply shook his head. The others tried to make small talk with him before and after meetings. Ruth offered him cookies. Leo joked about the weather. Even Claire gave him a warm smile one evening and said softly, "You remind me of my dad." Ray would nod politely, but never reply. It wasn't coldness. It was something else. A weight behind his silence that no one dared to disturb. Keanu noticed it from the beginning. Every week, he watched how Ray's eyes flickered when others spoke about their loved ones, how his jaw tightened, how his fingers fidgeted with the sleeve of his jacket. There was pain there, but it was sealed behind walls built from years of habit. He had seen that look before, in mirrors and movie roles alike, the look of a man holding back an ocean. After the third session, as the group began to leave, Keanu lingered behind while Ray slowly gathered his things. When everyone else had gone, Keanu walked over and said, "There's a diner down the street. Best black coffee in the city. You want to grab one?" Ray hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "I'm not much for talking," he muttered. Keanu smiled faintly. "Then we can sit in silence." Something in his tone disarmed the man. After a long pause, Ray sighed and nodded. "All right. Coffee, but no promises." They walked through the cool evening air to a small diner tucked between two apartment buildings. The neon sign buzzed above the door, casting soft red light on the wet pavement. Inside, the smell of bacon and sugar hung in the air. They sat in a corner booth, two steaming mugs between them. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just quiet and alive. Finally, Ray's voice broke through it, gravelly and low. "Talking won't bring her back," he said, staring into his cup. Keanu looked at him and answered softly, "No, but silence won't bring you back either." Ray's hand stilled on the mug. His eyes flicked upward, meeting Keanu's for the first time. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, lingering long after they'd been spoken. Ray didn't answer right away. He looked down, tracing the rim of the mug with his thumb. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, Keanu saw the weariness that years of grief had etched into him. "She was my wife for 40 years, Ray said finally, his voice rough. 40 years, and she still looked at me like I was the only man in the world." He gave a short laugh, one that carried no joy. "I used to tell her she'd get tired of me one day. Guess she proved me wrong." Keanu smiled gently, saying nothing. He didn't push, he just listened. Ray sipped his coffee, then continued in a softer tone. "Her name was Evelyn. We met when I was 20 and dumb as a fence post. She worked at a diner, not too different from this one. Wouldn't give me the time of day at first. Said she didn't trust men who smiled too much." His eyes glistened, the corners crinkling with both love and pain. "But she came around. We built a life. 3 kids, a little house out in Glendale. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours." He stopped there, staring out the window as cars passed through the drizzle outside. "What happened?" Keanu asked quietly. Ray's throat worked as he swallowed. "Cancer," he said. "Fast one. One day she was laughing at me for burning the pancakes, and 3 months later she couldn't get out of bed." His hand trembled slightly as he set the mug down. "When she went, It was like the sound got sucked out of the house. Even the clocks seemed to stop ticking. Keanu looked down at his own cup, letting the silence stretch before speaking. That kind of silence can swallow a person whole. Ray nodded slowly. It did. I stopped going out. Didn't see the point. The kids called, but I didn't want to talk. I'd say, I'm fine, even though I wasn't. His voice cracked slightly. I guess I just thought if I stayed quiet long enough, the pain would die down. But it didn't. It just sat there, waiting. Keanu nodded. That's what grief does. It waits for you to give it a voice. Ray let out a long breath. You know, I didn't plan on talking tonight. Haven't talked to anyone about her in almost 2 years. Keanu smiled faintly. You just did. Ray chuckled softly, shaking his head. Guess I did, didn't I? The waitress refilled their cups without a word, sensing the gravity of the moment. As steam rose between them, Ray's expression softened for the first time since the meeting began. You really believe talking helps? He asked quietly. I do, Keanu said. It doesn't take the pain away, but it reminds us we're still alive. Ray sat back, letting Keanu's words sink in. His eyes drifted toward the window again, where the rain had softened into a mist. The neon sign outside painted a red shimmer across the glass, faint but steady like a heartbeat. He sighed, rubbing his hands together. I haven't felt alive in a long time, he said. Ever since she passed, I've been waiting for something to make sense again. But nothing does. The house is too quiet. The bed's too big. Even the air feels wrong. Keanu nodded, his voice gentle. That's how I felt too. Like the world kept moving, but I'd fallen behind somewhere. Ray looked up, curiosity flickering in his tired eyes. You lost someone too, huh? Keanu hesitated for a moment before answering. A few someones, he said softly. People who were my world. And when they were gone, I thought the best thing I could do was stop feeling altogether. But pain has a way of reminding you that you still care, that you still love. The hard part is turning that love into something that keeps you going. Ray studied him for a long time, then nodded slowly. You sound like her, he said, his voice roughening. Evelyn always believed in finding purpose in pain. She used to say, if you can't heal, help. I didn't listen to her enough when she was here. Keanu smiled faintly. She sounds wise. She was, Ray said. She could make a room feel warm just by walking into it. Every Sunday, she'd bake bread for the neighbors. Said it made her happy to feed people. Even after she got sick, she made me promise I'd keep baking. I haven't touched the oven since she died. His voice dropped to a whisper. Maybe that's why it still feels like she's gone. Keanu leaned forward slightly. Maybe you should start again, not because she's gone, but because she'd want you to remember her with life. Ray was quiet, his fingers tapping lightly against the mug. You really think it'd help? Keanu nodded. You don't have to move on. You just have to move with her. That simple line hit Ray harder than he expected. He blinked rapidly, looking away to hide the moisture in his eyes. After a long pause, he murmured, Maybe I'll bake next Sunday. Maybe I'll bring some to the group. I think she'd like that, Keanu said. When they finally stood to leave, Ray extended his hand. It was a firm, grateful handshake. Thank you, he said. Not for the coffee for this. It's what we do here. We keep each other walking. The following week, Ray showed up to Project Lantern carrying a small basket of fresh bread. He didn't sit in silence this time. When it was his turn to speak, he began with a trembling voice. Her name was Evelyn. The room listened. The healing had begun not through therapy, but through sound, through story, through the courage to speak. The weeks following Ray's breakthrough brought a quiet transformation to Project Lantern. What had started as a small circle of 6 people had grown into a gentle movement, one that spread not through advertisements or social media, but through whispers, kindness, and word of mouth. Every Thursday evening, the lights in Haven Hall glowed softly through the rain, a beacon for anyone who needed to be seen. Keanu noticed the difference almost immediately. New faces began appearing at the door, people holding photos, folded letters, or simply their own silence. Some came after reading the flyers. Others arrived because a friend had told them, "There's a place where people listen." It wasn't therapy. It wasn't religion. It was simply presence. Ruth now brought cookies every week. Leo helped set up chairs. Maria, whose grief had once left her trembling, had begun welcoming newcomers with a steady smile. Ray always came early, carrying warm loaves of bread wrapped in linen cloth. The smell of it filled the room, soft and comforting, like Evelyn's memory living through him. And then there was Claire. She didn't miss a single meeting. Her confidence had grown, her voice stronger with each passing week. One night, she stayed behind after everyone had left, helping Keanu stack chairs. She turned to him and said, "You know, when I first came here, I thought I'd never laugh again. But now, when I hear other people talk, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. Hope." He smiled quietly. "You give that to others too." She hesitated before speaking again. "I've been thinking. Maybe I could help lead one of the meetings. I don't mean take over, just be there for the ones who are new. Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who's been through it." Keanu looked at her for a long moment, admiration shining in his eyes. "I think that's a beautiful idea," he said. From that night on, Claire became one of the steady hearts of Project Lantern. She greeted people at the door, listened to their stories, and sometimes just sat beside them when words wouldn't come. She no longer saw herself as someone defined by loss, but by what she could give because of it. "Helping others helps me survive," she told the group one evening. "It reminds me that Daniel's love didn't end it, just found new ways to live." The impact rippled beyond the walls of Haven Hall. Local grief counselors began attending sessions to observe, not as professionals, but as fellow humans. A hospital chaplain from Pasadena wrote to ask if she could start a similar group for families who had lost loved ones in the ICU. Even a small-town librarian in Oregon sent a message, saying she'd heard about Project Lantern from a friend and wanted to begin a chapter in her community. Through it all, Keanu remained humble and quiet. He refused to let his name become attached to the project. When a journalist emailed asking for a comment, he politely declined, replying only, "It's not about me. It's about the people who find light in it." Each week, more stories arrived. Handwritten letters, emails, and notes slipped under the door. Some were from widows, others from parents who had buried children. One was from a veteran who said he hadn't spoken to another soul about the war in 20 years until he sat in a Project Lantern circle. "You gave me back my voice," he wrote. Keanu read each one in silence, often late at 4 night by the same candle he had lit, the day Claire's first letter arrived. Every word reminded him that grief, when shared, could turn from isolation into connection. The letters kept coming, each one carrying the weight of someone's sorrow and the spark of their survival. Keanu kept them in a wooden box near his desk, tied neatly with a ribbon. When nights grew long and memories heavy, he would untie the stack and read a few at random. There were messages from all over the country, teachers, nurses, soldiers, single fathers, widows, each one thanking him for creating a place where grief could breathe. One letter came from a man in Detroit who had lost his teenage daughter in a car crash. He wrote, "I thought about ending my life every day for a year. Then someone told me about Project Lantern. I went to a meeting last week. I didn't talk, just listened. But for the first time, I didn't feel like dying. Thank you for giving grief a home." Another came from a woman in New York who ran a support group for hospital workers. "We work around death every day," she wrote, "but we never talk about it. Now we do." Each letter reaffirmed what Keanu had begun to sense, that the light of one small flame could travel farther than anyone expected. When the first satellite groups began forming, Keanu's team offered quiet support. He insisted they keep it informal, no branding, no promotion, no headlines. "People don't need a movement," he said in one meeting with his foundation staff. "They just need a moment with someone who understands." Claire, now one of the coordinators, began visiting neighboring cities to help others start their own circles. She traveled with Ray and Maria, meeting with local volunteers who wanted to learn how to guide conversations gently. At every stop, she carried Daniel's drawings in a folder, using them as both symbol and story. "This is how it started," she'd explain softly. "One drawing, one memory, one person brave enough to speak. Soon, Project Lantern gatherings appeared in community centers, libraries, church basements, and even parks. They were all slightly different, some large, some small, but the heart of it remained the same, a space for the wounded to walk together. Keanu watched all of it unfold, with quiet amazement. He refused to let any cameras in or any sponsors attach their names. "It must stay pure," he told Claire one evening after a meeting. "The moment it becomes about attention, it loses its purpose." She smiled knowingly. "You mean it stops being about people?" He nodded. "Exactly. The simplicity of it was what made it powerful. No one came for fame, therapy, or validation. They came for connection, and they found it." At one meeting in San Francisco, a man who had lost his wife stood up and said, "I came here broken, but hearing all of you, I realized grief isn't a wall, it's a bridge." Keanu later read that quote in one of the local newspapers. Someone had posted about the session online, calling Project Lantern a quiet revolution in compassion. The story spread softly across communities, inspiring countless others to start gatherings of their own. When Keanu heard that, he smiled not with pride, but with peace. For the first time, he saw what this had become. It wasn't a project anymore. It was a living sanctuary, something that belonged to everyone who had ever lost someone they loved. He walked through the empty hall that night, chairs still arranged in a circle, and whispered to himself, This is what light was meant for." It was late one afternoon when Keanu's foundation office received an unexpected email. The message was from a young independent filmmaker named Ethan Cole. He introduced himself simply as someone who had lost his father to suicide 5 years earlier. He explained that he'd been following the quiet spread of Project Lantern and wanted to capture its spirit on film. "Not as a movie," he wrote, "but as a message. The world needs to see what healing really looks like." When Keanu first read it, he felt an immediate hesitation. Cameras were the very thing he'd tried to avoid from the start. The beauty of Project Lantern was its anonymity, its safety. He worried that putting it on film would turn something sacred into something performative. A few days later, Ethan showed up at the community center after a session. He was in his late 20s, thin, with soft eyes and the cautious energy of someone who had been through more than his age suggested. He introduced himself with quiet respect. "I didn't come here to make a movie about you," he said earnestly. "I want to make a film about them, the people who come here. I want to show how grief can become a kind of courage." Keanu listened, arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. "You understand what this place means to them, right?" he asked. "It's not about cameras or storytelling. It's about being real, being safe." Ethan nodded immediately. "I promise, I'll be invisible. No spotlights, no scripts, just truth." Before Keanu could respond, Claire approached from across the room. She had overheard part of the conversation and smiled gently at Ethan. "He's right to be careful," she said, glancing at Keanu. "But maybe you're right too. People need to see this. Not the fame, not the names, just the light." That night, after everyone had gone, Keanu sat alone in the empty hall, thinking. He replayed what Claire had said earlier that week. "Helping others helps me survive." He realized that maybe there were thousands more out there who didn't even know something like Project Lantern existed. People still trapped in silence, waiting for someone to tell them it was okay to speak. The next day, he called Ethan. "If we do this," he said, "it has to be under one condition. The focus stays on the participants, not on me. This is their story, not mine." Ethan agreed without hesitation. "I wouldn't have it any other way." And so, quietly, without press releases or publicity, the filming began. The cameras were small, handheld, and unobtrusive. They captured the room as it was simple, raw, unfiltered. There were no retakes, no lighting adjustments, no rehearsed lines. Just people, stories, and the steady pulse of shared humanity. The first footage they shot was of Ruth talking about her husband, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She said, "He taught me how to dance when we were young." After he died, I couldn't listen to music for years. Now when I hear it, I don't cry anymore. I sway. The moment was pure. Ethan lowered the camera, his eyes wet. Keanu quietly placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "That's what real healing sounds like." As filming continued, the stories deepened. Each session brought new faces, new voices, and emotions that could never be scripted. Ethan captured them all with quiet reverence. The footage wasn't glossy or dramatic. It was human, imperfect, and honest. There were pauses, stutters, trembling voices, and long silences that spoke louder than words. One night, he filmed Ray sitting with his basket of bread beside him, talking about Evelyn. "I used to bake because she loved it," Ray said softly. "Now I bake because it keeps her close. The smell reminds me that love can outlast breath." The camera zoomed slowly on his hands as he broke the loaf in half, steam rising between his fingers. Keanu, standing off camera, swallowed hard and wiped at his eyes. Another evening, Claire sat before the camera holding Daniel's candle drawing. She spoke in a voice that quivered but didn't break. "For a long time I thought grief was a punishment, but now I see it's proof that I loved someone enough to miss them forever." When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, not from the participants, not from the crew, not even from Keanu, who turned away to compose himself. Ethan worked quietly in the background, blending into the circle, as if he'd always been part of it. Sometimes he filmed from the back of the room, other times from a corner, never interrupting. The participants barely noticed him after a while. What he captured wasn't performance. It was life unfolding between broken souls who had learned to find meaning again. One particularly powerful scene came when Leo, the young veteran, shared his first laugh in months. The group had been talking about small moments that reminded them of the people they'd lost. Leo smiled faintly and said, "My buddy used to sing horribly off-key just to annoy me. The other day I caught myself doing it in the shower." The laughter that followed was soft, tender, but real. Ethan's camera stayed focused on Leo's face as his smile turned into quiet tears. Between sessions, Keanu would help Ethan review the footage. They sat in the back room of the center, the only light coming from the laptop screen. Every story they watched felt like a heartbeat. "It's not just grief," Ethan said one night. "It's grace. People don't see enough of that anymore." Keanu nodded, emotion heavy in his chest. "You're showing them what love looks like after loss," he said quietly. As the weeks went on, word of the documentary spread within the community. Participants who had once been hesitant to speak now volunteered to share their stories. One mother brought a faded photograph of her teenage daughter who had died from an overdose. She looked into the camera and said, "I thought her story ended the day she died. But now, by telling it, I realize it's still being written." That single line became the emotional centerpiece of the film. When Ethan showed Keanu the rough cut of that moment, neither of them spoke for a long time. Keanu finally whispered, "Keep that in. Don't touch it. That's truth." The project that Keanu had once feared might cheapen their purpose had instead deepened it. Each frame revealed what he had always known but never fully seen. Grief, when shared, becomes light. Behind the scenes, he often had to step away to collect himself, wiping his eyes quietly where no one could see. Yet every tear was worth it. Project Lantern had given him something he hadn't felt in years, a reason not just to remember, but to hope. 2 months later, the trailer for Lantern: The Faces of Grief quietly appeared online. It wasn't promoted by a studio or backed by any campaign. Ethan had uploaded it with a simple caption: "A film about pain, love, and what remains." Within hours, the world found it. The first 30 seconds showed a series of faces, ordinary people sitting in a circle of mismatched chairs, Ruth clutching a photo of her husband, Leo tracing his friend's dog tags, Claire holding Daniel's drawing of a candle. Then, Keanu's voice, calm and measured, broke through the silence. "The pain doesn't go away, but we can learn to walk with it." That single line spread like wildfire across social media. By the next morning, the video had reached millions of views. People shared it not as fans, but as mourners finding language for their own losses. The comments section filled with messages like, "I lost my son 5 years ago. This made me feel seen," and "Finally, someone is showing grief without pretending it's beautiful." But with the attention came the noise. Entertainment outlets ran headlines like, "Reeves's most personal project yet," and "Hollywood star turns his grief into art." Some journalists praised him for his vulnerability, calling the film a work of quiet genius. Others accused him of exploiting tragedy for sympathy, of using other people's pain as a platform for his image. At first, Keanu tried to ignore it, but the headlines multiplied, dissecting his every word and gesture. One article even speculated that he was profiting from the documentary, a claim that stung because he had personally funded every cent of Project Lantern and had refused to take any credit for it. Claire noticed the tension when he arrived at the center one evening. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. As the group gathered, she waited until everyone had left before speaking. "You've seen what they're saying, haven't you?" He nodded, his hands folded. "Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? People will believe anything but the truth, that sometimes we just care." She watched him quietly for a moment before replying, "You told me once that silence doesn't heal. Maybe this time, you should speak." He hesitated. "I don't want to feed the fire." "Then don't," she said softly. "Just tell the truth." That night, Keanu sat at his desk, staring at the candle that had become his silent companion through this journey. The flame flickered steadily, as if urging him to say what needed to be said. He opened his laptop and began typing. His statement was short, only a few lines. "Grief is universal. It belongs to all of us. If sharing mine helps even one person heal, that's enough." He posted it without hashtags, without context. Then he blew out the candle and went to bed, not knowing what would happen next. By morning, Keanu's message had spread across the world. It wasn't just trending, it was resonating. News anchors read his words aloud on television. Commentators, fans, and even his critics began quoting the line that would soon become synonymous with Project Lantern. "If sharing mine helps even one person heal, that's enough." The tone online shifted overnight. The same outlets that had questioned his intentions now began to reconsider. Psychologists, grief counselors, and faith leaders spoke out in his defense, calling his approach an act of collective empathy. A prominent grief foundation wrote, "What Keanu Reeves has done isn't self-promotion, it's service." Claire called him that afternoon, her voice bright with emotion. "Have you seen the response?" she asked. He smiled faintly through the phone. "A little. I didn't expect it to quiet down this fast." "That's what honesty does," she said. "It speaks for itself." The week of the premiere arrived with more anticipation than anyone had imagined. Tickets sold out in hours, not because people wanted to see a celebrity on screen, but because they wanted to see themselves in the stories being told. When Keanu arrived at the small independent theater in downtown Los Angeles, there were no red carpets or flashing cameras, just candles lined up along the sidewalk, one for every person whose story had been shared in the film. Inside, the audience was a mix of people, parents, widowers, students, nurses, veterans. Many clutched tissues or photographs of loved ones. As the lights dimmed and the first notes of soft piano filled the room, Keanu sat quietly in the back row beside Claire. The film unfolded as Ethan had promised, raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. There were no flashy edits, no narration, only real voices telling real stories. Ruth describing her husband's last dance, Leo admitting his guilt and his laughter, Ray smiling through tears as he broke bread for the group, and Claire, her voice trembling as she said, "You don't move on. You move forward with them in your heart." When the lights came up 90 minutes later, no one spoke for a full minute. Then the applause began, not the kind born of excitement, but of reverence. People wiped their faces, hugging strangers beside them. One woman whispered, "That was my story," while another said softly, "I didn't think anyone understood until now." Ethan, standing near the aisle, looked toward Keanu. His own eyes were wet. "You did it," he said quietly. Keanu shook his head. We did it. Later, when he stepped outside, he found candles still burning on the sidewalk. Someone had placed a handwritten note by the door. It read, "Thank you for giving grief a voice." He stood there for a long moment, the cool night air brushing against him. For the first time since that day in the bookstore, he felt something shift inside him. A peace that didn't erase the pain, but honored it. The critics who once doubted him would later write glowing reviews, calling Lantern a masterpiece of empathy and a reminder that love outlives loss. But Keanu didn't care about reviews or fame. He only cared about the people who walked out of that theater a little lighter than when they entered. As he left, he glanced back one last time at the flickering candles. "If even one person heals," he whispered, "then it was worth it." The following evening, the theater hosted a small post-screening discussion. The film had already become a phenomenon in its first 24 hours, touching hearts around the world. But tonight's event wasn't about celebration, it was about reflection. A simple banner above the stage read, "Project Lantern. The conversation continues." Keanu sat beside Ethan on one end of the stage, with a few of the documentary's participants seated next to them. Among them was Claire. She wore a navy dress and carried Daniel's candle drawing folded neatly in her hand. Her expression was calm, but her fingers trembled slightly. She had spoken to audiences before during community sessions, but never to a full theater of strangers. Ethan opened the discussion, thanking everyone for coming and explaining that the purpose of the film was to remind people that healing is not a finish line. It's a journey we walk together. Then he turned to Keanu. "When we first met," Ethan said, "you didn't want to be in front of the camera. What changed?" Keanu smiled softly. "People," he said simply. "I realized that this wasn't about being seen. It was about helping others feel seen. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stand beside someone in their pain." The crowd murmured in quiet agreement. A few nodded through tears. Then Ethan handed the microphone to Claire. She hesitated, glancing at Keanu before speaking. "I wasn't sure I could do this," she began. "But if this project has taught me anything, it's that truth deserves to be spoken." The room went completely silent. She took a breath and continued. "A year ago, I didn't want to live anymore. I don't say that lightly. I had lost my son, Daniel, and every morning felt like punishment. I would wake up and wonder why I was still here when he wasn't. I stopped answering calls. I stopped seeing friends. And one night, I decided I was done. I remember sitting in my car in the garage, thinking how peaceful it would be if everything just stopped." The audience held its breath. Keanu lowered his eyes, his jaw tightening. "But then," she said softly, "I saw something on my phone, a photo of my son taped inside my wallet. I looked at his smile, and something inside me broke open. I decided to drive instead. I ended up in a bookstore, not knowing why, just needing to be anywhere but home. That's where I met Keanu. I didn't even plan to speak, but I did. And when he hugged me, something changed. He didn't say it would be okay. He didn't try to fix me. He just stood with me." Her voice trembled as she looked toward him. "That moment didn't erase my pain, but it kept me alive long enough to find this Project Lantern. And through it, I found people who helped me breathe again." She paused, then said softly, "He didn't fix me. He walked with me." The words struck the audience like a quiet storm. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a single person began to clap softly at first, then louder. Within seconds, the entire theater was on its feet. The sound grew until it filled every corner of the room, a wave of emotion that lifted Claire's trembling form on stage. Tears ran freely across faces in the crowd. Some were strangers holding hands, others simply closed their eyes and let the applause speak for what words could not. Claire pressed a hand to her heart, overwhelmed. She wasn't used to attention, but this wasn't about fame, it was about truth. Her gaze drifted toward Keanu, who sat still, his head bowed slightly. When he finally looked up, His eyes glistened. He didn't smile for the cameras or wave to the audience. He simply mouthed the words, "Thank you." When the applause finally faded, Ethan leaned toward the microphone. "This," he said softly, "is why we made this film." Backstage afterward, the atmosphere was different. The hum of excitement outside faded into a deep stillness. Claire sat on a wooden crate, still clutching Daniel's drawing. The edges were worn now, the crayon colors faint from years of handling. She looked up as Keanu entered the small room. He gave a faint, tired smile. "You were brave," he said. She shook her head gently. "I was terrified, but you did it anyway," he replied. "That's what courage is." She looked at him for a moment, the emotion still raw. "You know, when I said you walked with me, I meant it. You didn't just keep me alive. You reminded me that being alive still means something." Keanu's voice grew quieter. "You've done the same for me, Claire. You reminded me that what we build from pain can outlive the pain itself." She blinked back tears. "Did you ever think this would reach so many people?" He shook his head. "Never. I thought it would stay small, just a circle of broken people helping each other stand again. But it became something bigger because of people like you. You gave it a heartbeat." She smiled softly, tracing the edge of Daniel's candle drawing. "I think Daniel would have liked you." Keanu chuckled lightly. "I think I would have liked him too." The sound of applause from the theater drifted faintly through the walls again, mixed with murmurs and the rustling of people leaving. Claire stood and took a slow breath. "You know, for the first time in years, I'm not afraid of tomorrow." Keanu nodded, his eyes gentle. "That's the miracle, isn't it? Grief doesn't go away. It just teaches us how to keep living." She smiled. "Then we'll keep walking." He reached out, and they embraced, no cameras, no speeches, just two people holding onto the same light that had once saved them both. Outside, the marquee still glowed with the film's title, Lantern. Inside, the spark that had begun with one hug in a bookstore had now become something eternal, a shared fire that would continue lighting the way for others lost in the dark. A week after the premiere, Claire called Keanu early in the morning. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of something long overdue. "There's a place I've been avoiding," she said. "The spot where it happened. I think it's time I went there. Would you come with me?" He didn't hesitate. "Of course." The drive took 2 hours north, through winding California roads, lined with oak trees and fields that shimmered in the late afternoon Sunday. They barely spoke during the trip, but the silence was gentle, not heavy. Claire kept Daniel's candle drawing folded neatly in her lap, her thumb tracing the lines as the car moved steadily forward. When they reached the town's edge, she directed him toward a narrow road that curved along a hillside. At the bend stood a small wooden cross, surrounded by faded flowers, stuffed animals, and weathered notes. Time had worn everything but the love that lingered there. Claire's breath hitched when she saw it. She opened the door slowly, her steps deliberate, as though approaching an altar. The air smelled faintly of rain and pine. A breeze swept through the valley, carrying the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a river below. Keanu followed her quietly, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. He handed them to her without a word. Claire knelt beside the cross, brushing away fallen leaves. The name Daniel Morgan was carved neatly into the wood, along with a simple engraving of a heart and a date that marked the end of his brief life. She traced the letters with her fingertips, tears spilling freely now. "I used to think coming here would destroy me," she said softly. "But it hurts more to stay away." Keanu stood beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered. "Sometimes facing the pain is how we stop it from owning us," he said gently. She nodded, her voice trembling. "The day it happened, I told him we'd go to the park after school. He was so excited. I was late picking him up because of work. I never forgave myself for that." Her hand shook as she placed the lilies at the base of the cross. "For years I thought if I came here, I'd have to admit it was real. That he was really gone." Keanu knelt beside her, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to let go of him, Claire. You just have to let go of the guilt." She turned to look at him, tears still streaming down her cheeks. "How did you do it?" He paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "I didn't," he admitted. "But I learned that pain can live beside peace. They don't cancel each other out, they grow together." She looked back at the cross, her breathing uneven. "Then maybe it's time I try." Keanu nodded quietly. "You're not alone in it." They stood there for a while, the wind brushing through their clothes like a soft whisper, carrying both sorrow and release. Claire stepped closer to the edge of the road, where a narrow dirt trail led down toward the river below. The sound of the water was faint at first, then grew louder as they descended, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beating of her heart. Keanu followed silently, keeping a careful pace behind her. When they reached the bottom, she stopped by a small wooden bridge that crossed the stream. The sun was beginning to lower, turning the river into a ribbon of gold. Claire stood for a moment, her hands tightening around something in her pocket. Then she opened it and revealed a small blue toy car, chipped and faded with age. "He loved this," she said softly. "Wouldn't go anywhere without it. He used to roll it across the kitchen floor and say it could fly faster than any plane." Her voice broke into a quiet laugh. "I found it under his bed a few weeks after the accident. I could never bring myself to throw it away." Keanu watched her closely. "You don't have to throw it away," he said gently. "You're just letting it go where it belongs." She looked down at the car in her palm. The light glinted off its scratched paint. Then, after a deep breath, she knelt by the edge of the bridge. "Goodbye, sweetheart," she whispered. "Thank you for loving me." She released it into the water. The toy spun once, caught in a small current, then drifted downstream. For a long moment, they both stood still, watching it disappear into the shimmer of the setting. Sunday Claire's hands trembled as she wiped her face. "I thought this would feel like losing him again," she said quietly. "But it doesn't. It feels like he's finally free, and maybe I am too." Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder. "He'd be proud of you." She turned toward him, her eyes glistening. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," he said softly. "You faced the hardest thing a parent can face, and you chose life anyway. That's something even he would have admired." They stood side by side, the silence between them, now peaceful instead of heavy. The wind picked up, scattering petals from the lilies across the water. Claire took a slow, steady breath, as though breathing for the first time in years. When they began walking back toward the car, the world around them seemed brighter. The sky had deepened into a soft orange hue, and the sound of the river faded behind them. At the top of the hill, Claire looked back one last time. The wooden cross was still visible from where they stood, framed by sunlight and trees that swayed gently in the wind. She smiled through tears. "I used to think this place was where everything ended," she said. "Now I see it's just where something new begins." Keanu nodded quietly. Sometimes healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying love into the next chapter. As they drove away, the sun dipped below the horizon. In the fading light, the cross glowed faintly in the rearview mirror, no longer a symbol of loss, but of love that had finally found its peace. The months following Claire's visit to the accident site marked a new season for Project Lantern, one no one had expected. The documentary continued to travel quietly from city to city, but its true power spread through word of mouth and screens. Around the world, people found themselves drawn to its message. They didn't see a film about celebrities or sadness. They saw themselves. Letters began arriving in waves. At first, a few dozen, then hundreds, then thousands. They came from every corner of the globe. Handwritten notes, typed messages, emails with subject lines like, "You saved me, and I finally spoke his name again." One letter came from a woman in Italy who had lost her husband to the pandemic. She wrote, "When I watched the film, I realized that love doesn't disappear when breath does. I lit a candle that night and felt him near me again." Another arrived from a prison in Texas, written in block letters on lined paper. "I've been locked up 10 years, the inmate wrote. "My mom passed while I was inside. I never said goodbye. Watching Lantern made me write her a letter anyway. It's sitting in my cell. I talk to her every night now. Thank you. Keanu read every message he could, often late into the night, sitting in the quiet glow of his apartment. The letters piled up around him, stacks of paper bound by rubber bands, envelopes marked with smudged tears and fingerprints. Sometimes he smiled softly. Other times he had to stop reading, the emotion too heavy to carry in one sitting. He shared some of the letters with Claire and Ray during their weekly gatherings. They'd sit together, coffee cups steaming, reading stories aloud until their voices grew thick with feeling. "It's strange," Claire once said, "how people so far away can feel so close." One evening, Keanu read a message from a nurse in India. Her handwriting was shaky but determined. "I've watched too many people die alone," she wrote. "After Fane, seeing your story, I created a small circle at the hospital. We light a candle for each life we lose. We call it our Lantern Hour. It helps us remember that every soul deserves light." That line stayed with him for days. Lantern Hour. He couldn't stop thinking about it. A few weeks later, he sat with his foundation's small tech team, explaining an idea that had come to him in the middle of the night. "What if there was a place," he said, "where everyone could light their own candle digitally from anywhere in the world?" They looked at him curiously. "You mean like an online memorial?" "Not just that," he replied. "More like a wall of light. A place where people can post messages, photos, anything they want to say to those they've lost. A shared space of remembrance, not sadness." And so, the Lantern Wall was born. The Lantern Wall went live quietly on a cold December evening. There were no press releases, no grand announcements, just a small note on Project Lantern's homepage that read, "Light a candle, share a memory, keep them with you." Within hours, the site began to glow. The first message came from a woman in Chicago. "For my brother, who never stopped believing in me, you still guide me every day." Then another appeared, and another. By midnight, hundreds of messages covered the screen, each one represented by a small golden flame that flickered softly against a dark background. Keanu watched the wall from his laptop, speechless. The glow seemed almost alive, as though every story carried its own pulse. Each flame opened to reveal a message, a name, or a short note of love. "For Dad, for my best friend, for my baby girl." The simplicity made it powerful. Every post carried a truth no camera could capture. Over the next few days, the wall expanded beyond anyone's expectations. Schools began creating class pages to honor students they had lost. Veterans posted tributes to fallen comrades. Parents shared photos of children gone too soon. There was no hierarchy of pain. Every story mattered equally. Claire helped moderate the submissions, spending hours each evening reading through new messages. Sometimes she would pause, tears gathering, as she read about a mother in South Africa lighting a candle for her son. Other times, she smiled at the notes filled with humor and warmth. "Grief doesn't have to be only tears," she told Keanu one night. "Some of these messages sound like laughter remembered." Ray helped design the phrase that appeared at the top of every page. "No one walks in darkness when others carry the light." He said it reminded him of Evelyn, of how she had always baked bread for neighbors who'd lost someone. "This wall is like her kitchen," he said. "Always open, always warm." The global response grew overwhelming. News outlets finally caught wind of the project, but by then it had already become unstoppable, a movement of hearts rather than headlines. People from war-torn countries, hospitals, and refugee camps began submitting posts. A soldier from Ukraine wrote, "For my brother, who never made it home, I light this candle so the world remembers he lived." Keanu read that message in silence for a long time. Then, quietly, he lit a real candle on his desk and whispered, "You're remembered." Within 3 months, the Lantern Wall hosted nearly 1 million posts. Each candle flickered on screens across the world, phones, tablets, computers, illuminating the darkness with shared love. Some nights, Keanu would sit alone, scrolling through the wall in silence. He found himself smiling through tears. humbled by how humanity could unite not through perfection, but through pain. Claire once said, "This wall isn't just for the dead, it's for the living who refuse to forget." And she was right. As winter turned to spring, Project Lantern had become more than a gathering. It was a living tapestry of memory. Every candle was a heartbeat, every message a promise that love, even in loss, endures. The night was quiet, wrapped in that kind of stillness that feels both heavy and peaceful. Outside, Los Angeles shimmered faintly beneath the haze of city lights, but Keanu's apartment was dim except for the glow of a single candle burning on his desk. It was the same candle he had lit months ago, back when Claire's first letter arrived, the same flame that had carried him through sleepless nights and countless stories of loss. He sat at the desk, a notebook open before him, pen resting loosely in his hand. For a while, he didn't write. He just listened to the faint hum of the night, to the wind brushing against the window, to the quiet rhythm of his own breathing. On the shelf beside him sat a small photo frame containing 2 pictures. One was of Jennifer Syme, smiling beneath a burst of sunlight. The other was a black and white ultrasound image, a daughter he had never held, yet who had shaped every corner of his heart. The candle flickered gently, its flame casting shadows that danced across the page. Finally, he began to write. "Grief isn't a wound to close," he wrote slowly, the words forming with deliberate care. "It's a doorway we learn to live beside." He paused, the weight of that sentence settling deep inside him. For so long, he had believed grief was something to overcome, something to outlast. But now, after everything, the letters, the circles, the tears, shared in silence, he understood it differently. It wasn't something to conquer. It was something to carry, like a companion who reminded you of love's cost and its permanence. He continued writing, his handwriting uneven but sincere. "When Jennifer died, I thought the world had stopped. When our daughter never took her first breath, I thought I had stopped too. But maybe life isn't about moving on. Maybe it's about learning to move forward with them." Every time someone speaks their loved one's name at Project Lantern, I see that truth again. They're not gone. They've just changed shape. He glanced toward the small box of letters sitting beside the desk, messages from strangers who now felt like family. Their words had become part of his nights, their pain part of his understanding. It struck him how universal loss was, how every person, no matter where they lived or who they were, carried some version of it. And yet, somehow, they all kept walking. He turned the page and wrote another line. "Love doesn't end. It transforms. It becomes the strength that lifts someone else when you can't." For a moment, he closed his eyes. He could almost hear Jennifer's laughter, faint and fleeting, like an echo from another lifetime. He imagined what their daughter might have looked like. Now her smile, her eyes, her voice. He thought of Claire, standing at the river, releasing the toy car. And he realized something. Every story he had witnessed wasn't about endings at all. They were beginnings, born from the ashes of loss. Keanu sat still for a long time, the pen resting motionless between his fingers. The room was so quiet that the candle's flame seemed to speak louder than sound. It moved gently with each breath he took, glowing and shrinking, as if alive. He glanced once more at the page and continued to write. "Maybe grief is love's shadow," he wrote. "It follows because it was born from the same light. Without love, there would be nothing left to miss. Without memory, there would be nothing left to hold. We don't heal from loss, we grow around it." He set the pen down and leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window. The first faint traces of dawn were beginning to edge across the horizon, soft streaks of pink and gold cutting through the city's gray. He realized how long he had been sitting there, writing through the night, accompanied only by that small flame and the voices of memory. He thought of Claire again, of her standing at the river, her tears falling as she let Daniel's toy car drift away. He could still hear her words. "He didn't fix me. He walked with me. The simplicity of that truth struck him deeply. In helping her, he had unknowingly helped himself. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape, just as he'd written. It had become a kind of light. He looked back at the candle and whispered softly, "You'd be proud of them, Jennifer. Of all of them." He imagined her there beside him, smiling in that quiet, patient way she used to. He imagined his daughter too, the child he had never held but had carried with him every step of his life. "You're still here," he said under his breath. "Both of you." He reached out, flipping to the final page of the notebook, and wrote one last thought. "We all carry lanterns. Some burn bright, some flicker, but together they make enough light for the world to find its way home." He stared at the sentence for a long while, letting it settle like a prayer. Then, with a steady breath, he closed the notebook and set the pen on top. He leaned forward, his face calm, and whispered, "Thank you for walking with me." Then he gently blew out the candle. For a moment, the room was dark, but through the window, the first full beam of morning sunlight stretched across the desk, landing directly on the closed notebook. The warmth of it filled the space where the candle's glow had been, proof that light always finds a way back. Outside, the city stirred to life. Somewhere across the world, people were lighting candles of their own on screens, in rooms, at gravesides, each one a reflection of the same enduring truth. Love doesn't end when life does. It carries on, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, flame to flame. Keanu sat quietly, watching the dawn spill across the sky. For the first time in years, the day ahead didn't feel heavy. It felt like hope. The day of the anniversary arrived with a soft golden light that seemed to linger over Los Angeles. The city buzzed quietly, unaware of the gathering forming beneath the hills of Griffith Park. Word had spread through the Project Lantern community that there would be a remembrance walk, a simple evening, where anyone who had lost someone could come, light a lantern, and let it rise into the fading sky. There were no tickets, no speeches, no cameras, just hearts coming together. By late afternoon, hundreds of people had assembled along the park's winding trails. Families carried lanterns painted with names and drawings. Children held photos of parents. Couples walked hand in hand, carrying the memory of someone they loved. The air was warm but calm, the kind of weather that made it feel as though the sky itself had chosen to stay still for them. At the edge of the crowd, a man in a gray hoodie moved quietly, unnoticed by most. He didn't want to stand out. Keanu preferred it that way. He watched from a distance as volunteers handed out candles and small paper lanterns stamped with the words, "Light for every soul." Claire had helped organize the event, working tirelessly for weeks to make sure every person who attended felt welcome. As the sun began its slow descent, a soft voice over the microphone invited everyone to gather near the open field. "Tonight," the voice said, "we remember not just those we've lost, but the love they left behind. Every lantern you see is a story, a heartbeat, a promise that love doesn't fade." Keanu stood near the back, holding his lantern loosely in both hands. It was simple, unadorned, except for one handwritten message, for Jennifer, for our daughter, and for every soul still learning to walk with the light. He looked around and saw faces he recognized: Ruth, standing with her daughter, Ray, holding a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth to give away afterward, Leo, his military jacket faintly visible in the dimming light. And there, near the front, was Claire. She was helping a young boy tie his lantern string, her smile patient and kind. For a moment, he simply watched her. She had changed so much in a year. Her grief had softened, her voice had grown stronger, her eyes clearer. She no longer looked like someone surviving loss. She looked like someone living through it. When she straightened up, their eyes met across the crowd. For a brief second, she froze, then smiled a real quiet smile that said everything without words. She made her way through the people, her lantern glowing faintly in her hands. When she reached him, she didn't say much. She just looked at the lantern he carried and whispered, "It's beautiful." He smiled faintly. "So is this," he said, nodding toward the sea of lights around them. Claire nodded. You started something you can't ever measure. Keanu shook his head gently. No, we did. The last glow of daylight faded behind the hills, leaving the park bathed in a deep amber hue. The air felt hushed, reverent, as hundreds of small flames began to flicker to life. One by one, people lifted their lanterns, the paper shells glowing softly like tiny suns. The sound of quiet sobs mixed with gentle laughter, the beautiful noise of remembrance shared among strangers who suddenly felt like family. Claire and Keanu stood side by side near the front of the field. She looked around, her eyes shimmering. I used to think grief was a shadow, she said quietly. But it's really just love looking for somewhere to go. Keanu nodded slowly. Then tonight, it found its way home. A volunteer's voice echoed through a small speaker. On the count of 3, we release the lanterns. Each one carries a name, a memory, and a message of love. Ready? The crowd raised their lanterns toward the twilight sky. 1, 2, 3. Hands opened everywhere. Hundreds of glowing lanterns rose at once, floating upward like stars being born from the earth. The sight was breathtaking. The sky filled with soft golden light, each flame drifting higher, carried by the evening breeze. Some people cried, some laughed, and others stood in silence, hands clasped over their hearts as they watched their love ascend. Keanu tilted his head back, following his own lantern as it joined the others. It rose slowly, steady and calm, its glow merging with the rest until it became part of a sky full of gentle fire. He thought of Jennifer, of his daughter, of everyone Project Lantern had touched: the letters, the meetings, the voices. He felt them all there, alive in the air, woven into the light above. Claire turned to him, her face lit by the reflection of hundreds of flames. Do you ever think they can see us? She asked softly. Keanu smiled faintly. I think they've been walking with us the whole time. She took a deep breath, her gaze following the lanterns as they drifted higher and higher, slowly disappearing into the night. Then maybe this is their way of saying thank you. He looked at her, eyes full of warmth. Or maybe it's ours. They stood together as the last of the lanterns vanished into the dark, leaving only the stars behind, so many that the sky itself seemed to shimmer with memory. The crowd began to hum a quiet tune, a melody of peace and unity that spread softly among them. When it was over, Claire stepped forward and hugged him tightly. It wasn't the desperate embrace of grief, but one of gratitude, steady and full of meaning. He held her just as firmly, knowing that no words were needed. As they pulled apart, she whispered, "Thank you for walking with all of us." Keanu smiled gently. "Thank you for reminding me how to keep walking." They watched the horizon together, the world bathed in quiet light. Around them, candles still flickered along the path, guiding people back through the park. Above, the last lanterns disappeared into the vastness of night, their glow merging with the stars, a living reminder that grief, when shared, becomes love multiplied. The night after the Remembrance Walk, Keanu returned home in quiet reflection. The city lights blinked faintly through the window, but inside, everything was still. On his desk sat the familiar candle, the same one that had burned beside every letter, every journal entry, every moment of silence. Its wax was low now, melted down by time, but it still carried the same steady glow. He sat down, removing his hoodie, letting the weight of the day settle around him. The echoes of voices, laughter, and tears from Griffith Park lingered in his mind. He could still see the sky filled with lanterns, floating higher until they became one with the stars. He could still feel Claire's embrace, Ray's warm handshake, and the hum of hundreds of hearts beating together in shared remembrance. He looked at the candle for a long time before speaking, his voice calm but rich with emotion. "Maybe you've lost someone too," he said softly. "Maybe there's an empty chair at the table, a photograph you still can't move, or a song that hurts to hear. If you have, then you know grief doesn't follow a map. It comes and goes like the tide, but the love that made it possible, that never disappears." He paused, taking a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. I used to think healing meant forgetting, but now I know it means remembering differently. It means carrying their light instead of their absence." He leaned back slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You might never stop missing them, but that doesn't mean you stop living. The pain may never vanish, but neither will the love." For a moment, silence filled the room again. Outside, the faint sound of traffic passed in the distance. He reached forward, adjusting the candle wick until the flame burned a little brighter. "When we started Project Lantern, I didn't know what it would become. I just wanted to create a place where people could talk, where they could be seen and heard without judgment. But it turned into something more. It became proof that when grief is shared, it turns into connection. And when love is remembered, it turns into light." He looked into the camera again, his eyes steady, his words deliberate. "So if you're watching this right now, wherever you are, and you're carrying someone in your heart, don't hide it, don't run from it. Carry them with you. Keep walking. Because every step you take is another way of saying, I still love you." The candle flickered gently beside him, its glow reflected in his eyes. He sat there for a few quiet moments, as if waiting for the flame to finish his thought. Keanu stayed seated, his hand resting near the base of the candle. The flame swayed lightly, as if responding to his presence. "I've learned something through all of this," he said quietly. "You can't rush your way out of grief. You can only walk through it. And sometimes, the most healing thing you can do is simply let someone else walk beside you." He smiled faintly, his expression soft and contemplative. That's what Project Lantern became a reminder that no one has to carry pain alone. It doesn't matter who you are, where you live, or what you've lost. When people come together to remember, they create something stronger than sorrow. They create hope. He reached for a small envelope sitting beside the candle. It was one of the letters he had received through the lantern wall from a young woman in Brazil. He read a short passage aloud. She wrote, "I thought grief would end my life. Instead, it taught me how to live it differently. Thank you for reminding us that even broken hearts can still give light." He smiled gently and folded the letter back. That's what this has all been about, finding light in the cracks. The room glowed softly now, the candle's light bouncing off the window pane. He looked directly into the camera, his tone tender but certain. "Wherever you are, whoever you've lost, I hope you remember this. You are not broken for missing them. You are proof that love was real." He leaned forward slightly, the light warming his face. "And maybe, just maybe, that love can help someone else find their way too." For a long pause, he simply sat there, the silence carrying as much meaning as his words. Then, he reached for the candle and, instead of blowing it out, added a second match to it, making the flame burn brighter, taller. "For every story, for every person remembered," he whispered, "may the light keep growing." The camera began to pull back slowly, revealing the quiet simplicity of the room. On the wall behind him hung Daniel's candle drawing. Claire had given it to him after the remembrance walk. Its crayon lines glowed softly under the light, as if the drawing itself held its own small flame. He looked at it and smiled. "Maybe that's what love really is," he said softly. "1,000 flames that keep burning long after we're gone." He turned back to the camera for one final moment, his voice steady. "So if this story touched you, if it reminded you of someone you still carry in your heart, light a candle for them tonight. Tell their story in the comments. Share their name, their memory. Let this space be another wall of light, one that keeps growing, because grief shared becomes love multiplied." He paused one last time. And if you want to keep walking with us, like, share, and subscribe. There are more stories of hope to come, and maybe the next one will be yours. He lit one more candle beside the first, the twin flames flickering side by side. Then the screen slowly faded to black, leaving only the warm glow of their light.